I use more than any other, it's the word balance. And I think, let's be real, there's a lot of challenges that you'll face as like a growth designer, and most of those have to do with balance. And so there's kind of like two different big things I think growth designers need to balance. One is balancing, the business side with the user experience side. And then the other one is, balancing, I think this is more what you touched on, which is balancing like velocity and quality.
Hi guys, welcome to the Grow Design podcast, where you get to learn about grow design and its principle through experienced growth leaders and growth experts, and how they've implemented growth design in their product and organization at large. My name is Emmanuel, a product designer currently working at Lead Genius. In today's episode, my guest is Chase Denomme, head of design at disco.co and a growth community leader at designers.co. Today marks the end of season 1, where we have been exploring what growth design is and how to become a growth designer. In this episode, Chase will be sharing us a guide on how to build a successful growth career. He'll be discussing on how to navigate the challenges that come with being a growth designer, the tension, how to balance the tension, and how to grow personally and professionally. I'm quite sure this episode is going to be a very interesting one to you, and I'll allow you to dive deep into the episode. Welcome to the Grow Design Podcast. With me today, I have a very, very exciting guest. He's sort of an inspiration to me. I've been following him for a while, and he's one of the leaders of the growth.Designer.co community. He's also a designer at designers at disco.co. Hi, Chess. How are you doing today?
Hi, Emmanuel. Doing good. Doing good. How about you?
Yeah, I'm fine. I'm fine. Super excited to have you on this show today.
Yeah, me excited as well.
Yeah, so can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. Quick introduction. So my name's Chase. I currently am the head of product design at Disco, which is a online learning and community platform. Also, a community lead at growth.Designers.co, where I get the joy of connecting with lots of growth designers in the space. And yeah, also a father of 3 and husband, which is what I do outside of my professional job, and avid Lego builder.
Perfect. Can you tell us your story, how you got into design generally, and how you just started?
How I got into design, I mean, I kind of grew up in design. I had a very unfair advantage growing up with a father who was a creative director and ran his own advertising agency, and a mom who was just super involved in like fostering my curiosity and just like growth mindset. And so always like growing up was really, really passionate about art and design. And then also business as well, just because of how I saw my father applying that like creative lens in a business landscape. So really started doing design at a young age. In high school, I started making websites, designing tattoos for people. I was doing custom paintings on guitars, skateboards, basically any way that I could make a dollar off of doing creative work. I was trying to do at an early age. And then from there, just went on to study arts in business as well at the University of Waterloo. And yeah, the rest is history.
Hmm. I would say lucky for you there because you had the opportunity of studying art, and having like a creative mentor. Let me put it that way. Since your dad was a creative director at his own agency, that's like an easy path for you to discover or uncover that talent of yours as at the early stage. On unlike some of us who just crashed into design. Personally, I have sort of a background in engineering. But I discovered design while I was in school, and it's been an amazing experience for me. Both ways, starting early or even crashing into design. But it's really been an amazing journey, and super happy to hear the part of your story. So I'm just curious now. From studying art, in school, and the journey of becoming a designer, how did you get yourself into growth design?
Ah, yeah, it's a great question. Honestly, I think without knowing, I've been a growth designer kind of my entire life. But I would say how I more like formally got into it is I was studying arts and business at the University of Waterloo, and I had a really great co-op placement at SAP, which was actually not working as a designer. It was working as a business analyst at SAP, but on a lot of strategic projects that were incorporating design thinking into innovation projects across SAP. And that was kind of my, I guess, aha moment into becoming a growth designer because I was always passionate about design. I was always really interested in business as well, hence my earlier career being more as a business analyst. And that was my big kind of aha moment on, you know what, I can actually be a designer, but really bring my business lens, my, experience with data to the table to have more impact as a designer. And I can really prove the value of design, the ROI of design. And so that was kind of, from there, I guess the rest is history as well. I basically became serial design lead at a lot of startups, including my own startup for a while. Led, growth design teams at growth to scale stage businesses like Vidyard. I ran a accelerator and sort of design studio for startups that were in like the early product market fit stage to growth stage. And as well, led design at a product design agency that really focused on experimentation and around kind of growth strategies for businesses on the product side.
Hmm, amazing. That's really amazing. Studying art and business in school, and fortunate to find yourself as a business analyst at SAP. That's like will I say a good coincidence, but that's
Yeah.
really lucky for you. And I think that's really a wonderful experience for you. Finding yourself in that circle of business where business and design really meet. I think that's really, really great for you. So, what do you think, or in your own opinion, there's this conversation about you are a designer, product designer, user experience designer. So, in your opinion, what's the difference between these two professions as a product designer or a growth designer or growth design or product design? What's the difference?
I feel like I get this question a lot, and I candidly somewhat don't like it because a lot of what general core product designers work on and growth designers work on is the same thing. But if we want to like really drill into the differences, a lot of the times it's just how the designer works, or what area where they typically play. And so I can kind of break down the differences. It's not like a hard line that's really easy to draw, but for the most part, I think core product designers really focus on problems to solutions, whereas growth designers more so focus on uncovering opportunities. It may not always be a particular problem, but it's opportunities that they're looking for to turn into outcomes. The second one would be, core designers are typically focused on creating core value for the product, where growth designers are more focused on, connecting more users to that value as early as possible, as often as possible, and then scaling that value over time. So, I mean, with that, core designers typically will work across the entire product, whereas growth designers, depending on what team they're working on or the structure of their org, are really focused on specific impact areas across sort of that customer life cycle. Another difference I find is that core product designers are usually more focused on applying design heuristics, whereas growth designers are a little bit more focused on applying behavioral psychology. And then I think another one that's really important is just how they work and the how they approach velocity. So with core product design, I would say most teams are predictability over velocity. versus growth design is more focused on velocity over predictability. And so what I mean by that is a lot of core product teams are really, really focused on, delivering features within a set time frame that maybe they've communicated to customers on the roadmap, and being really predictable about those estimates. Versus a growth designer is velocity over everything. And so, not that predictability doesn't matter as a growth designer, but it really can't come at the sacrifice of velocity, because the goal of a growth designer is really to learn, right? And to learn at the fastest, cadence as you can. And so that one kind of leads me to the last one, which is really like core product designers are shipping to release. They're shipping to get a feature out into the hands of customers is their primary goal. And the goal of a growth designer is to ship to learn, right? Everything's about learning. It's kind of winning through learning. And so we recognize that not everything that we ship is going to be fully released to all users, is going to be a success right away. It's all in the goal of learning.
I would say this is so far the best explanation I've got when it comes to the difference between these two professions. Like for me, and two things really stood out to me. The first one, when you talked about how a good designer kind of focus on connecting users to the value, whereas the product designer just designs around creating the core value of a product, which really stand out. And the other one for me, which I so much love being a growth designer, is that you are shipping to learn. A product designer are shipping sort of for releases, right? It's not something bad, but then it's just two different focus. And like you said, they do the same thing, working on the same design principles, like the same design principle guides both professions. But then I feel some of these little differences kind of speaks a lot when it comes to the way they work across the team and in a team. So I absolutely agree with you with that. So you touch on a particular aspect which you talk about how a good designer focus more on behavioral design, psychologies, right? So can you sort of explain in a nutshell how the role of psychology when it comes to how does psychology plays in growth design? Why for a product designer deals with design heuristics, right? But as a growth designer, what does the role of psychology like in growth design?
Yeah. In a nutshell, because our role is really focused on connecting more users to value as early as possible, as often as possible, and then scaling that value, we're really, really focused on, decision making, which is very attached to just like human behavior. And then also increasing, motivation, which is obviously very attached to human behavior, and then increasing, a user's ability to do things, which often has to do with eliminating moments of friction. And to do that, you really have to understand, how people behave in order to affect and improve that, ability to handle the jobs that they're trying to do. So, with that, really, we're trying to optimize. We're in that space of just trying to optimize those moments where we can have a lot of impact, and really understanding, people is a key part of that. And so we always talk about data when it comes
Mm,
to, growth design. And, seeing the data is one thing, but the other part of that story is like, why are we seeing this in the data, right? And like really getting behind that, often comes through, more qualitative work that we can use to kind of identify some of those like whys, but then also just like, recognizing certain, cognitive biases that might be coming into play. And so really understanding some of those like core behavioral, design principles are really handy when it comes to, making sort of those changes that you want to see and adopting the product.
absolutely. Yeah. I think I love those answers, right? I think one of the things that really stood out to me is what you talked about as a good designer. One of the things is focusing on eliminating moment of friction. You know, which is really true because all these things ties around human psychology, the way we behave, how we make decisions, and that's one of the things that ties around how a good designer, kind of uses the principle of psychology or behavioral science to kind of infuse it into their design process, which is really, really great. You also touch on a particular topic that really excites me, which will lead me to the next question of data, right? So, as a designer, or let me say growth designer, how do we, or what's the process of making research that is quite different from the general traditional product designer, right? I hear a lot about growth designers talking about the use of data in, trying to uncover a lot of things. So, does it mean that as a growth designer, you don't do the normal user research, or how does data come in place in all this
Yeah.
process?
No, you absolutely still need to do that qualitative research. I think the difference is that, as a growth designer, you're staying close to the data. And maybe in like a core product design role, again, totally depends on like the team and the individuals on the team. But typically, you might be relying a lot more on your product counterpart or even like a data analyst on your team to be sort of giving you that context around, what they're seeing in the data, and then you're using that to kind of make your own decisions. I think what a growth designer focuses on is like being really, really close to that data and doing that discovery work on their own. So living in tools like Full Story, really diving deep into the data and trying to get a better sense of why things are happening, which is the qualitative part, right? So we can use that quantitative side to maybe get some insights, but there's some extra, unknowns that we're gonna have from there. So it's still important not to just like look at the data and say this is what we're seeing and that's that, because that's not telling the full story. There's often times where even when shipping like an experiment, we might see results that really surprise us, and I think all too often teams just like roll past it and they go, "Well, the data has told us this, so we're going to move forward." And there might be, there might be something wrong with the data and like the instrumentation. B, there might be that the actual experiment that rolled out, there's like a bug in the experiment or something unexpected that's actually changing the results of what, they were trying to validate. And so I think, as a growth designer, it's still really key that we do that qualitative work, really understand why things are happening. And I also just think on the data side, there's different tools that we have in our tool belt. So I talk a lot about like A/B tests sometimes being overhyped. I love A/B tests. Who doesn't love a great A/B test to get to some quick learnings? But it's not always the answer, right? And I think as like growth designers, we have a lot of tools in our tool belt that we can choose the right validation method that will get us, the learnings that we need. Because depending on what we're trying to learn, we might need like a different quality of learning, like a different sort of like we require a different confidence level in what we're trying to learn. There's sort of like the speed at which we need to learn that particular thing. And that can help us choose, there's ways of validating before we actually even build something, right? So sometimes doing that simple qualitative work, putting things in front of, customers, user testing ideas, um, can be really easy ways that like designers can validate ideas, or at least validate a larger quantity of ideas to sort of narrow down into what we actually want to like build to maybe run A/B tests on. And the other thing is sometimes depending on what stage of business you're working on, you might just not have the volume that you
Yeah.
require to really use the data as a good source of truth. And so in that case, growth designers can leverage more of that qualitative side.
Yeah, perfect. I think the last part of your question really of your answer sort of answers the next question I was about to ask. I think the combination of both quantitative and qualitative approach to researchers' use of data and user interviews really tells the full story. Depending only on data alone will not give you the full story or give you the full understanding. When you sort of infuse the qualitative aspects, which is user interviews, customer discovery calls, and everything, it gives you the full story, which is absolutely correct. But before we leave the aspect of this growth design and product design, before we dive deep into growth design fully, I want to touch on this aspect, which is a very popular question. Also, is like when you are designing for growth, right? How do you balance the aesthetics appeal with the functionality or the effect of or the functionality aspect of your designs? How do you balance those two together when designing for growth?
Oh, I love that. I think, if there's one word I use more than any other, it's the word balance. And I think, let's be real, there's a lot of challenges that you'll face as like a growth designer, and most of those have to do with balance. And so there's kind of like two different big things I think growth designers need to balance. One is balancing, the business side with the user experience side, and then the other one is, balancing, I think this is more what you touched on, which is balancing like velocity and quality, right? So when you're working on a project, how do you find that like right fidelity? You're really looking for that like Goldilocks quality, right? It can't be too hot or too cold. It's got to be just like the right level of fidelity. And it really all depends in like what are you trying to test? And for the most part, what else is in the market that exists as like alternatives, right? So like the bar for quality changes, I think, quite a bit.
Mm,
And so if there's a lot of alternatives on the market on like what you're trying to like test and validate, the quality bar can't be low because there's sort of like a minimum bar that's almost expected in the market. And so if you try to like ship an experiment or, validate an idea and you really sacrifice on the quality of it, you're not even really validating the idea with your particular market because it hasn't hit that quality bar that users might be expecting. And so, you need to get to a certain level of quality bar. It depends on like a variety of factors. It also depends on like how fast you want those learnings to come in. But I think for the most part, in terms of like how do you kind of balance that, it's really nice to focus on like cutting on scope versus cutting on quality. I think a lot of growth teams focus on we need to get this experiment out, and so we're going to cut on the quality, right? It's going to be this like really rough. They think we're being really resourceful and we're going to put out this rough experiment. But instead of cutting down on the scope of the thing that they're trying to test and delivering a high quality, solution or experiment that's actually going to validate the hypothesis that they have, really just focusing on cutting down on the scope, right, and keeping that quality bar nice and high. I think the other one is just like I mentioned before, choosing the right validation methods. So you don't always need to have, a full functioning feature to be able to test. Sometimes it could just be like a high fidelity prototype that you're testing and isn't something that's actually built. And so choosing the right method certainly helps out quite a bit. And then I also think just like, focus. And a lot of the times growth teams try to take on like too much like scope and too much like work. And the more you can focus on like the highest impact areas, the better that sort of like quality output will be.
mm. Thank you. Thank you so much for that question, for that answer, which is absolutely spot on. Moving deep into product to growth design now, I have this very salient question, which I sort of stumbled on it during one of your presentation. I think there was a crash course you did on growth design. I think about last week or 2 weeks ago. You talked about this wheel of growth designer, which brings me to the next question. As a growth designer, right? Or let's say as a product designer, you so much care about customer experience or user experience and talk about how you deliver this product. But as a growth designer, what do you care about? We talk about the use of data. Do you care more about the use of data? Do you care more about the business goals? Or do you care more about the customer? How do you balance this together?
Oh, yeah. Which one do we care about more? The answer is equally. It needs to be, I think, whenever I talk about growth design, I talk about delivering authentic shared value to the business and the user. And I think you hit it spot on. That's the tension, the balance tension that we
Yeah.
face that I mentioned earlier, which is, and I think a lot of the times you feel it at multiple levels. There's obviously the projects you're working on, that tension between the business goals and the user goals, but there's also like the teams that you're working with, right? Usually the design team is over indexing on sort of the user experience customer side, and the growth team is over indexing on the business metrics and like driving outcomes side. And
Hmm.
so both sides might be sacrificing on one side versus the other. And I think it's like our role as the growth designer not to do that and to go like dead center. And so you probably saw my two little wheels of like the heart is in the middle, right? That's where we live, is, connecting those dots and delivering that shared value that equally meets the user's goals with the business goals. And I think the only way you can strike that balance as well is when I talk about, what is growth design. I also mentioned just like sustainable growth, right? And I think all too often growth teams, it's really, really easy to focus on short-term tactics to get those like short-term results. That if you're focusing on hitting a certain business metric, oftentimes there's some sort of tactic that you can apply to get some small wins that drive a business metric. But those tactics might actually come with a sacrifice of the user experience, and might actually be really detrimental to the business on more of like a long term, from a more long term perspective. And so I think that's we're sort of the warriors in between that are kind of balancing that tension between the design team and like the growth team. Um, and yeah, my answer is equally important, which is not always a fun place to be.
Exactly. I think it's one of the biggest tension because at some point you want to be you want to lean towards the business aspect, like balancing the business, like, okay, we need to move these metrics. And at the other hand, we feel like this experience might not be the best experience for the users, but you just have to
Yeah,
find that balance, which is critical. And sometimes, in my own opinion, I think it takes a lot of, would I say, experience to be able to know the balance, like finding that balance between both, within those key, what's it called, key pillars of this whole thing.
yeah,
Of it takes more experience to be able to know how these things could be balanced when you are
yeah.
working on it. So you touched a little bit about some of those challenges, right? So let's dive deep into it a little bit. So from your experience, right, what are the biggest challenges that a good designer often face, and how have you overcome it in your career as a good designer?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one we talked about earlier, which is really balancing that speed and quality,
Yeah.
which I gave a couple, I think, pointers on. The other one is balancing that business and design tension. And I didn't get into the flywheel, but I think one of the ways that we bridge that gap between the business or growth team and the design team is, again, by just having more empathy and like understanding each side and telling that full story. And so on growth teams, we're often structured and focused on acquisition, activation, retention, monetization. Like that's what we're looking at. And the design team, it might be like, those are the business goals, and it's not really telling the journey that a user would go through. But we can see the user journey in sort of that flywheel or funnel, however you like to look at things, which is, the moment of acquisition is really when we're turning a user from a stranger into being like an evaluator, right, of our particular product. That moment of activation is when somebody goes from evaluating the product to really being like a beginner. They're leveling up, right, in that journey. And then, the moment of retention is when they're going from a beginner to like a regular, right, and they're hooked into the product. And then obviously, once somebody gets to that monetization stage, you hope that they've leveled up to the point that they're a champion inside of your
Hmm.
product, that they're excited to be giving you their hard earned dollars. They're hopefully telling other people about it and giving you testimonials. And so I find by like, we have sort of like the growth design flywheel of looking at those business goals through also the lens of the journey, the customer life cycle, right? And the stages that they're kind of going through on their journey. And really like thinking about like what's important to that user at those different moments. And if we're focused on what's important for somebody to go from, a regular to being a champion user, we can really move the needle on those business metrics. And so I find just like having that framework that kind of combines the lens that both sides are kind of looking at things allows each side to have more empathy, to understand the value on like, hey, why is focusing on that user life cycle journey really important to hitting our business outcomes. So I think just like a lot of the times it's just like shared understanding and empathy, right? And so I think when we can create that shared understanding together, that kind of helps make all conversations a lot easier. And then the other part is kind of just like playing one another's game, right? When you talk about being data focused and looking at the business metrics, one thing I know we started doing at Vidyard that was really helpful is, for that activation section of turning somebody from, an evaluator to a beginner, we had like a scorecard, right? And so we would look at that scorecard. So it's very business focused. You get a score. We're showing sort of like the funnel of steps that you're going through and how you're hitting our business outcomes. But what we really started to like measure from like a quantitative perspective and
Mm,
also, capture from a more qualitative perspective is what's happening at each of those moments. And so
mm,
if the score of a particular area of activation, let's say in Vidyard's case, creating a video was really, really low, it's like, well, to hit activation, we need to improve video creation. And if we look at what's happening under video creation, the psychological state somebody is in when they're getting in front of a camera and trying to record like a script, we can identify and we can look at some of those more like design metrics, to figure out how we actually improve those business metrics. And one thing that was kind of brought up in that crash course was paper cuts. This idea of like paper cuts, and a lot of the times design teams are like, we want to focus on like these little polished stories, right, that are really impacting the experience. And for the business team, fixing one of those polished stories likely won't actually drive like huge results. But if you're really thoughtful around like continuously addressing some of those small paper cuts, it's kind of like the saying, like death by 1,000 paper cuts. A lot of small paper cuts add up. And I think we found at Vidyard too that when we looked at areas of our like activation score, moments that were really weak were full of paper cuts, right? And so maybe there wasn't like one overarching like big problem to address, but if there's a lot of really small things, that's really kind of like limiting the user's ability to actually succeed in that particular moment. And so I think that's a nice way to kind of like bridge the gap and deliver value to both sides.
mm. Yeah, thanks so much for that answer. I think one of the two things that kind of stood out to me that you also shared is about designing with empathy, like having more empathy to this aspect of design, and also having the sheer understanding. Um, it's very very key, to be able to overcome some of these challenges of balancing the tension, the speed between the balancing the speed and quality of your designs and everything. And I think it's really really key, as a good designer, to be able to have some of these key attributes. So I know that testing and experimentation, it's one of the bread and butter of a good designer, right? So testing is crucial to grow design, and having to learn. The only way you can learn is probably you test something and you see how customers react to it, and you take the learnings from it. So what are your approaches, or what are effective strategies to approach testing or experimentation as a designer?
Yeah. Well, I think when it comes to obviously like just going through that scientific process of once you find opportunity, just getting like really, really good at shaping up hypotheses, right? I think all
Mm,
too often too, people aren't good at setting good hypotheses.
mm,
And so the first step is just like having really being able to shape really good hypotheses. I think being able to quickly identify with that hypotheses, like what are the true like unknown, like what are the knowns, what are the unknowns, and as like a designer, I think part of it is like gathering context, right? Your role is to like gather context, and sometimes there's known unknowns. It's like I don't really there might be answers that we actually have validated, but there's just like a different person in the organization is the one that has the context. And so your part as the designer is to like help kind of do that assumption mapping and figuring out what those unknowns are, and then trying to understand, like, do we actually have some of those already answered? So you're able to kind of narrow down to, like, what do we really, really need to
Wow.
validate?
Mm.
Because I think it's also easy to focus on trying to answer questions that are really already answered somewhere. So that's kind of one. So, having really good hypotheses, being able to, identify and gather the right context to make sure that that hypothesis is the right one. Um, and then I think the next one is what I touched on earlier, which is like choosing the right validation method. Not every It's like we need to create the experiment plan on how we're going to validate this. And sometimes it's an A/B test. Sometimes it's not an A/B test. Sometimes it's one experiment. Sometimes it's a sequence of like several experiments, right? And depending on the answers that we get, we're going to have different experiments that we might run, after the fact. So I think as like a designer, just being really thoughtful around the approach and setting sort of that like sequence of experiments. And then obviously like how we design those experiments is just like finding that Goldilocks quality, like I mentioned earlier. And then obviously it's just like measuring, right? And making sure you're choosing the right metrics, which is not always easy. But yeah, that's we'll be diving, Ran we'll be diving real deep into this in the growth design school course that we're running. I think this is an area that, for people for designers that are new to growth, maybe not new to product design, but new to growth, this is like a key area just to like really understand a more scientific design process.
Yeah, definitely. Looking forward to the growth design school also. Maybe we can touch on it later on in the podcast when we're trying to close the session. We can dive deep a little bit to like an intro into the course because I know it's going to be into the school. So because they're a course, I know it's going to be going on for a while, different
Yeah.
cohorts and everything, just like Reforge. So
Yeah.
we'll talk more about it later on. But you touch a little deep about something, but I don't know if we can go into it because it's a little bit deep, which you talked about choosing the right metrics, right? And as my own personal experience, getting started as a growth designer, one of the things that was really challenging for me was trying to understand the right metrics I like we need to focus on the product, and also maybe identifying those growth loops because you know one very buzzword we talk like I don't think it's a buzzword, right? Creating a growth loop for a product, that's the sort of like the circle of how customer gets into the product, how they find value in the product, and how they are able to bring other customers. Like as
Hmm.
a growth designer, is there a method of understanding this? A method for you to able to create these metrics or determine these metrics and able to establish a growth loop for your product?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think we'll get into this in the course like as well. Like there's certainly like different types of loops that like already
Yeah.
exist out there. And so I think it's just like understanding what those different growth loops currently are and sort of like the different parts of those loops. To first you need to identify, like, does my product have that? Like, does my product have any of these like current loops? And sometimes, when it comes to just like identifying the metrics, it's yes, my product does actually go through, this particular flow. And so it's just choosing, what metric you're measuring at sort of like each stage and optimizing those metrics, right? So as a growth designer, we can either choose to optimize the current loops that we already have, or we can introduce new loops, right? And so we kind of did both of those at Vidyard. We had like a core, organic viral loop, which was you create a video. So obviously we're measuring, video creation rate. You share
Mhm.
a video, we're measuring, the share rate. And then you get a viewer on the video is sort of that last one. And at that last step, we're measuring, really a couple things. It's, how many views are you getting on the video, but also just like the virality, the like K factor around for how many people is it sent out to, how many are actually signing up then for Vidyard. So yeah, I think depending on your loops, it's all like contextual to the product around like what you're
Yeah.
actually like measuring, of course. But it's just figuring out, do I have these loops that exist? If so, what do I need to measure at each of these stages? And then if you don't have those loops, it's about creating those loops and then figuring out what those metrics to measure are.
Yeah, yeah. I think, like you said, it's more of contextual. Like it's different for each product. So taking one approach might not really be effective for another product. Like an approach might not be what equally works for the other product. So that's absolutely correct. You talked about the right tools, the right method for validating. So how do you choose the right tools now, or what are the tools available out there for growth designers to use in terms of? I know there are a lot of tools out there that are very very useful that you've used in your own opinion to improve experience and to also drive growth. So, what are the product out there that you've used, and what are the
Yeah.
method of choosing the right tools for different problems
Yeah.
that you faced? Yeah,
Yeah, good question. In terms of, I'll get into the tools. In terms of choosing the right method, again, it's kind of all contextual. It really depends. Like, what are you trying to learn?
yeah,
But like, let's say it's something like we would like to learn. It's really copy. If you're really focused on just like content and really focused on testing, different language, that's something that could easily be done on an A/B test, especially if you have like a large volume of users going that through that particular area. You could run, some A/B tests to test out different language. But that's also another one that if you have, a lot of options and maybe not a huge pool of users, you could do user testing on. And so you could use a tool like usertesting.com or Maze and use those to put a bunch of options in front of customers and actually see which one of those copies works out better. That's one thing that we did at Vidyard a lot as well for things like landing pages and copy. We did leverage user testing quite a bit to see what language resonated before we actually went to run experiments. So there's tools like that are on like the user testing side. Some other tools that I find really helpful are, there's so many. We live in this like golden age now of product no to low code product adoption tools. So
yeah.
tools like app queues, user flow, bento, dopt, can do. There's all these tools out on the market now that don't require a ton of dev resources. So these are ones that are like, they're made for growth designers, because as a designer, we can build, tours, like guided tours. We can build these onboarding surveys and checklists. Some of them have the ability to deliver more like personalized onboarding experiences, feature adoption flows. So these tools are amazing because without a dev team, we can ship, deliver them. The one that I'm, kind of trying out right now that I'm super interested in is Can Do, and has the ability to do like A/B testing and inline components, which really allows you to control a lot of that, experience. And so these are just like golden tools. I feel like every growth designer should like explore and get to know really well. And then I would say some other tools that are more on like the data side is just getting really good with data tools like full story, mixed panel, amplitude, heap. These are all tools that are good to just understand how to work with data. And this will be a big part of the course as well, right? Is we're going to get into not just like what a growth designer is and how to be a growth designer, but the most important thing is actually practicing and applying it, right?
Mhm.
And so we'll take a look at some of these tools and how to actually put things into practice.
Perfect. I think that's a whole lot of two you've mentioned. They talked about Candu, talked about Bento. I know those ones. He talked about user testing, mix panel. Yeah, definitely those are the toolbox for any good designer, because right now you want to move fast, and having to wait for engineers to maybe 2 weeks or 1 week of writing
Mhm.
codes and waiting before them to deploy and everything. With the advent of the no code, so you can easily just deploy. Just do this very very good looking designs, and it's not just design, but then it's live, and you can test some of those ideas very fast. And I think that's
Yeah.
really spot on to even allow us to leverage on building with speed, which is
Yeah.
absolutely great. Looking at growth design, right? I used to ask this question a lot. As a growth designer, how do you grow as a growth designer?
Oh, so many ways to tackle this question. I mean, the first most obvious one is I feel like it's easy to grow as a growth designer is having a growth design mindset, right? And like that's something that I feel like I've always just had as like a part of me. It's just like continuous growth and learning. And I'm sure a lot of listeners are having that mindset, right? They're listening to a podcast, they're continuously learning. I think on, how do you grow in terms of like kind of like leveling up your skills as a growth designer. I think definitely one side is having that growth mindset and just like establishing a really good culture of experimentation at the organization that you're working at. That's definitely one area. I think another area to just like continue to really like excel and learn in is just like business and product thinking. So, I do think continuously learning, taking courses that relate to like business product strategy are really helpful for growth designers to have that sort of business lens. And then in terms of just leveling up at your org, if we're talking about how do we grow in like our careers, it's really like deliver results, right? And value to both customers and the business is like the biggest thing. If you're delivering results, that's the first part of the puzzle. And the second part is being able to communicate really
Mm.
effectively those results that you're delivering, right? And I think that one can't be like underscored enough, but oftentimes we don't do a good enough job, establishing our voice as like a designer and really amplifying kind of our impact. And so being able to communicate those results is a key part of that. So yeah, how do you grow? I mean, you focus on the right skill sets and continuously just like learning. You focus on putting them into practice and just like learning through failing. And then how do you grow at sort of like the more like org career level, deliver results, communicate results.
Mm. Perfect. You talked about growth mindsets, talked about communication, how to communicate what you've learned and your findings, talk about continuous learning. I think these are really, really great principles or way of growing as a Christian. Thanks so much for that. Yeah, there is this question I have, and I almost forgot, and I just saw it right now. I'm like, as a designer, one of the mindsets we have as a good designer is about when you go through design processes, you make designs, and at the end of the day, this design might not make it out there in front of the customers because maybe it goes to this level of testing and doing some experimentation, and at the end of the day, it fails. So there's this sequence of failure that you might face. You design this flow before you find the right perfect flow or that perfect design, as that really solves that connects that particular value to the user. It takes a lot of failure or learning. So as a growth designer, how do you manage your expectation when it comes to experimentation and failing and everything?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think really hard, especially for like designers that are new to growth and coming in, because it's the reality they will face pretty quickly. But I think it's just in the mindset of like how you look at failure to start, and also perspective, right? I think it's really easy for us to get caught up in thinking that things always come really fast. But when you start looking at, how long it took companies to actually grow, how much they actually put out into the world that was a failure and didn't succeed, it's, you can kind of establish that context that things take time and more time than you might think they take. But also just like, how do you look at failure and just creating like a culture around failure where failure is not a bad thing, right? Failure is actually a good thing. And it's not like a win or fail culture. It's a win or learn culture, right? Like failure just is not a thing. You're either winning in
Mm.
the experiments that you're putting out, or you're learning things that are actually getting you closer to succeeding just at like a later point, right? And so I think it's a similar, struggle that startup founders, right? Like new startup founders are going to face, and part of it is just like embracing the journey, right? Understanding that it's a process. Failure is part of it, and just enjoying the journey along the way. And I know, even with teams, it's trying to to like look for the excitement in the failures, right? So when an experiment does not succeed, you can't go into sort of like that debrief with the team being really disappointed in it. It's more so like, what did we learn that's really interesting? Like being excited and like energized about like, hey, we learned this thing, right? I know we all thought that this was going to be a sure bet, and this is why this is a fun game that we play, right? Because it
Mm.
didn't work. It didn't work out the way we thought it would. And I think the more you can pull in that qualitative lens as well, it's not just like here's the quantitative results. It didn't succeed. The test didn't succeed. It's like here's like why, and we got to some like really interesting learnings around why this didn't succeed, and that's where design can really help tell like that full story and kind of make failing, I guess, a little bit more fun than it
Absolutely.
is.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I love the way you answer that question, which is having that, thinking about failure, think about it as win or learning. Like, what have you learned? Having that mindset of whatever you do, it's just a form of learning, not really failure per se, which is a very good way to manage your expectation when you go into some of this experiment and everything. Yeah, I think I have just two or three questions to go, and it's just the general question about growth. So, what are these common misconceptions about growth design that you've sort of noticed out there, if there are?
Yeah, maybe one is just that like growth design equals, and it's like one thing in particular, like growth design equals converting more signups. So people think that like growth
Mm,
designers just work at like top of funnel acquisition, increasing conversion is like what a growth designer does. Or, on the flip side, some people just think growth design equals onboarding. So I think a lot of the misconceptions is that growth design is just like focused on this one particular thing. Misconception could be, we see there's like, documentaries like the one on like social networks where growth designers are really focused on like dark patterns. And I think, especially in the growth designers community, like we believe in keeping growth good. And as designers, it's really like our role to keep growth good. And so growth design is not about implementing dark patterns to get like short-term results, right? It really is around still delivering that authentic user value. I think those are probably like
mm.
the two big ones.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, I like the one you talked about. Scroll designers are known for converting users. It's not really true, right? And we actually focus so much deeper in the product more than just the top of the funnel. Absolutely. So, going to the last question now. What are those books or what are those courses that are out there that you would really recommend to designers who are planning to make the shift, the mindset shift, the career shift? What are
Yeah.
those books and courses you would sort of recommend?
Yeah, I think just like a staple and was kind of like my very first really understanding more what growth design was is Hacking Growth by Sean Ellis. I feel like it's one of the like OG PLG books out there before PLG was even really a thing. I also think just like Design Driven Growth by Molly Norris Walker in the community is like a good actual like growth design book. And then the last one, which I should have mentioned earlier, is Testing Business Ideas by David Bland. It's a strategizer book. When it comes to thinking about like what method do I use for testing, that is like your toolkit. There's like 40 or 50 just like testing methods inside of that book. It does a really good job at outlining like kind of when to use different ones. So I would say that's kind of like your field guide for being able to find those right methods.
Perfect. So, what about courses? I know there's a school right now for growth designers out there. So, can you sort of talk more about it?
Yeah, I mean, we're super excited about the course. In the community, like we hear a lot about there's a lot of growth courses out there and they're really great growth courses that, I still recommend to designers all the time. But what we hear, I think, from a lot of designers is like, I got this really good understanding of like what growth is and like, how to work in growth, but I don't really know what that means for me as like a designer. And like, how does a growth designer actually work? How do I actually, put this into practice? What are the tools that I use? And so we still get a lot of like really basic questions around like being a growth designer that we decided to put together the course. The course is going to be a cohort based course style. So it's going to be a 5 week course. Each week we'll have a combination of asynchronous content that will come out, followed by an actual live class and like session. We definitely think that the value in learning comes with community and with learning with other people. And so we're excited to have both kind of like content, but also just like a network of other growth designers that you can learn from, right? It's not only the instructors that get to do kind of like the talking and the teaching, it's learning from other members as well. So yeah, it'll be 5 weeks, 5 modules. What we're going to cover is, what growth design is, how to actually be a growth designer. So the actual like processes and playbooks for putting it into practice. And then we're going to go along that flywheel around, how do we drive acquisition, activation, engagement, monetization, and expansion. And it'll be, I think, action packed with case studies on how things get applied, and then also activities on how we can apply it at work. And along the way, we'll kind of sprinkle in like what are the tools to use, and how might we use those tools as a growth designer. So I think this will be a really great course, and we're excited. As applying the growth mindset, we're just excited to learn as well, right? Like what will go well, what won't go well in the course, and we'll continue to run the cohort. And we're just really interested in learning and improving this over time for the community.
That's really good, and also really excited about it because I'm also going to be joining the course and looking forward to learning. Because for me, as part of having the growth mindset, anytime I see an opportunity for learn, I don't think about it. I jump on it, and I'm really
Yeah.
excited about it. And also, well, I want to say a big shout out to the growth designers community out there. So for anyone looking to make the shift into growth design, I think it's really, really valuable. We talk about the growth designers community because there, right there, you have a bunch of people who think the same way. Once you have a problem or question, you can really throw it out there. So I don't know if you can also talk more about the growth designers community so that anyone out there who wants to sort of join, what do they
Yeah.
stand to gain and everything.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, we're just a community of practice of, growth designers that are working in the industry. So we're open to growth designers at all different levels, from, introductory to just getting started to, in more of like a leadership role. It is like a application based community. So we do only let in designers that we think are really interested in working within growth. That's just to keep the quality bar again at like a certain level, and to make sure that it's not doesn't become a community of broadcast and promotion and spam. But yeah, it's really just open community. I think our community is one that we like to just like showcase and elevate others in the community, like yourself with running the podcast. And so there's lots of growth designers that are also working on just like cool side projects, or even cool businesses themselves, that we like to promote. So yeah, really, really, welcome everybody to join the community if you're interested in really practicing growth design, learning more about growth design.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for that brief introduction for the community. I will add all the links to joining the community, the links to the school, and also the links to all the products and sort of tools that you've touched on in the show notes. So finally, there is some lightning and fun question I do like to ask. Um,
Here we go.
just to close it, yeah. So just three questions, and I'll real fast about it. So, what are the top three products that you use daily and you love? Like, it could be digital, it could be physical products.
Oh, that's hard. I'm gonna go digital because they're just top of mind. But Webflow, Figma, Notion would be my top ones that I use all the time. Um,
Nice.
and if I can give one physical one, it's having a good chair. It
Nice. Yes,
is
that's true.
definitely key.
That's true. Absolutely. Yeah. The second is what are the top three books? that you've read that you'd like to recommend? I think you mentioned some, but
Oh, yeah, I think I answered those ones. I think it was Hacking Growth by Sean Ellis, Testing Business Ideas by David Bland, Design Driven Growth by Molly Norris Walker. Those would be my top.
the last one, if you were not a growth designer right now, or if you're not in the profession of design, what do you think you will be your current job right now?
Ooh, hard. I would be something still creative, probably a Google Doodler who does those fancy little drawings on the Google search screen, or a Lego designer slash builder of Lego sets. That would be fun.
Interesting, interesting. Wow, thanks so much, Chase, for this wonderful episode. It's really fun, having to have this conversation with you. I really appreciate the time. Thank you so, so much.
Yeah, it's been a blast. Thanks for having me on, Emmanuel.
And also, big thank you to everyone who has taken time to listen to this episode. If you found this very valuable, please do well to subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, on any of your favorite podcast app. Also, you can consider giving us some sort of review and leaving some comments on the podcast. See you in the next episode. Thank you.